Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, evening, whenever you happen to be listening. Welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. This, of course, is Sunday School, where we dive a little bit deeper into philosophy and theology and all those spiritual and religious things. We are going to continue on with reading Mere Christianity, and I'll offer my commentary on it towards the end. This is a series we've been doing, so if you're just hopping in now, I invite you to return to the beginning, to scroll back, because I think you'll get the most out of this if you work from beginning to finish on this project. I'm not saying C.S. Lewis, obviously, is somebody you can pick up. You can flip to any chapter, and I think you're going to get something out of it. And you won't be completely lost if you're just tuning in now. Especially, I think this chapter is something that probably can be taken as a standalone. But the whole project of this book is to provide a cumulative case for what he calls mere Christianity, Christianity in the merest sense. Those certain parts of most, if not all, Christians agree upon. So we're going to do that here in just a minute. But before then, a few updates. I just had a beautiful morning walk outside. It's a cool, little bit damp Wisconsin morning, but it was just quiet and lovely. A nice time for some sort of So obviously I pray a lot and I exercise a lot. So I really enjoy when I can combine the two. Do, walking prayer outside. It's just so much beautiful. So much beautiful, if that makes sense. So I'm just finishing up with that. I had an incredible conversation this week with Marianne Kane. That will be on Sunday School next week. We were kind of chatting back and forth and just kind of catching up on life, and she's had what she believes is a pretty profound, and I believe her on this because I've experienced this myself, a pretty profound calling to, really try and serve women in a way and get women to see them in the way that God sees them, as infinitely precious, valuable, beautiful, holy, regardless of their of what they can do. And that's what we spend a lot of time talking about. So she's been on this own spiritual journey of hers. So I invite her on the podcast. I'm like, hey, just come on and let's just talk about this. Like, let's just see where it goes. And I thought it was a ton of fun. And also because I think what she's doing is so important. But we spent so much time talking about, people's value is really based in what they are, not what they can do. And society has seemed to have distorted this so much, where people kind of more or less plug their sense of self-worth in all kinds of arbitrary things, the amount of money they have in their bank account, or their body fat percentage, or how they look. Certainly being a lot in the fitness industry and the business industry, this is something that I personally have to battle against, because that's a large way of how people are out there marketing themselves. But I don't want to contribute to that. So I'm what I'm trying to do is show that we can approach fitness, we can approach business, we can approach all these things in life that we want to be good at in a really healthy and virtuous way, and understand that our intrinsic worth and value is in no way connected to any of that. And I hope that Sunday School is helping is advancing that and serving that purpose. And I was so excited because Marianne, if you don't know who Marianne Kane is, she's the founder of My Oh My TV. She was one of the original kettlebell people on YouTube. We go way back, and I just was so excited to hear what she was doing that I just had to invite her on and talk about just to hear about kind of what she's been going through. She's a new mother, and she's kind of she's kind of what she's been going through. She's a new mother, and she's kind of she's felt this very particular religious calling, really. So that episode should be up next week. I think it was one of the just most open and genuine conversations I've had on the podcast yet. So I think you'll really enjoy it and get something out of that. I have some other cool guests lined up. I don't, but I'm not going to spoil any of that now. One of them is, I'm just going to keep it under wraps. You'll see when it gets here. But let's get on with the material, okay? It's Sunday. We should be relaxing. This is relaxing for me, by the way. I really enjoy doing this. It's just reading with I got my cup of coffee here. I'm going to read a book to you, and then just going to go play piano, actually. Hang out, play piano. Me and my son are going to go downstairs and practice the piano. We're both taking piano lessons together now, so we have our daily practice. I'm working on alternating fingers to, notes to a metronome, so that's the plan after this. Okay, so let's pick up my big fat book of Mere Christianity here, because I'm reading out of C.S. Lewis's Signature Classics. So, by the way, let me just give you a quick reading recommendation. If you don't have his Signature Classics, this is a collection of, his Signature Classics. And you can get it off of Amazon. And this includes Mere Christianity, The Screwtape Letters, Miracles, The Great Divorce, The Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed, The Abolition of Man, and The Four Loves. And I can't recommend all of those enough. So I would say go on Amazon, grab his Signature Classics, and just devour it. But we are on Mere Christianity, Book 3, Part 1, The Three Parts of Morality. And this is under the section now of Christian Behavior. So let me get a sip of my coffee, and we will begin. New French about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. He replied that as far as he could make out, God was the sort of person who is always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. And I am afraid that is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds. Something that interferes, something that stops you having a good time. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. That is why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. When you are being taught how to use any machine, the instructor keeps on saying, "No, don't do it like that." Because, of course, there are all sorts of things that look all right and seem to you the natural way of treating the machine, but do not really work. Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, or about moral idealism rather than moral obedience. Now it is, of course, quite true that moral perfection is an ideal in the sense that we cannot achieve it. In that sense, every kind of perfection is, for us humans, an ideal. We cannot succeed in being perfect car drivers or perfect tennis players, or in drawing perfectly straight lines. But there is another sense in which it is very misleading to call moral perfection an ideal. When a man says that a certain woman, or house, or ship, or garden is his ideal, he does not mean, unless he is rather a fool, that everyone else ought to have the same ideal. In such matters, we are entitled to have different tastes and therefore different ideals. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a, quote, man of high ideals, because this might lead you to think that moral perfection was a private taste of his own, and that the rest of us were not called on to share it. This would be a disastrous mistake. Perfect behavior may be as unattainable as perfect gear changing when we drive, but it is attainable as perfect gear changing when we drive. But it is a necessary ideal prescribed for all men by the very nature of the human machine, just as perfect gear changing is an ideal described for all drivers by the very nature of cars. And it would be even more dangerous to think of oneself as a person of, quote, of high ideals, because one is trying to tell no lies at all, instead of only a few lies, or never to commit adultery, instead of committing it only seldom, or not to be a bully, instead of being only a moderate bully. It might lead you to become a prig, and to think you were rather a special person who deserved to be congratulated on his, quote, idealism. In reality, you might just as well expect to be congratulated because whenever you do a sum, you try to get it quite right. To be sure, perfect arithmetic is, quote, an ideal. You will certainly make some mistakes in the calculations, but there is nothing very fine about trying to be quite accurate at each step in the sum. It would be idiotic not to try, for every mistake is going to cause you trouble later on. Every moral failure is going to cause trouble, probably to others and certainly to yourself. By talking about rules and obedience instead of ideals and idealism, we help to remind ourselves of these facts. Now let us go a step further. There are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another, or else collide with one another and do damage to one another by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way, and secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. Or if you like, think of humanity as a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need two things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune, and also each must come in at the right moment so as to combine with all the others. And there is one thing we have yet to take into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might all be in tune, and might all come out at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played nothing but dead marches. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived at Calcutta. Morality, then, seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the great purpose of human life as a whole, what man was made for. Notice that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first and forgetting the other two. When people say in the newspapers that we are striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean that we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. That is, they are thinking only of the first thing. When a man says about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else any harm. He is thinking only of the first thing. He is thinking it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run into the next ship. And it is quite natural, when we start thinking about morality, to begin with the first thing, with social relations. For one thing, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. And also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there is very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people at all times have agreed, in theory, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to be helpful to one another, but though it is natural to begin with all that, if our thinking of morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought at all. Unless we go to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. What is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that for our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think, and think hard, about improvements in our social and economic condition. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system, but as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make good men by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think of the second thing, the morality inside the individual. But I do not think we can stop there either. We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior, and it would seem at first sight very sensible to stop before we got there, and just carry on with those parts of morality that all sensible people agree about. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must be either true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant, responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, and I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself. Again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must either be true or false. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about if I am going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable, but it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. In fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what that would be. And immortality makes this other difference, which by and by has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. It seems then that if we are to think about morality, we must think of all three departments: relations between man, things inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one. Disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. It is dealing with the third that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. For the rest of this book, I am going to assume the Christian point of view and look at the whole picture as it will be if Christianity is true. Whew. That was tough. That book is really heavy, so I'm trying to hold it up. I should if I was intelligent, I would get a stand, or I would just read it off of my Kindle. When I went to record my audiobook for How to Be Better at Almost Everything, I should have. You think I would have taken some notes, because I went into a full studio, and they had an iPad on a stand, and I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And I'm like, is this just so it makes it easier to read? But they're also like, no, it also so we don't hear you turning the pages in the microphone. So sorry about that. You probably hear me turning the pages and sniffling and snorting, and I'm still rubbing the old sleepies out of the eyes too. So apologies for the few mistakes there. But hey, you get what you pay for with the Pat Flynn Show. So let's talk a kind of a big chapter, because now he's starting. He's actually, C.S. Lewis is so good. There's so much packed in here, kind of from a philosophical and theological standpoint. We have natural law theory of what can we know about human nature and what is good for human nature through reason alone. And here he makes comparisons with drawing straight lines and doing arithmetic. What he's getting at there is he's just kind of bringing the idea of natural law theory down to a very common level, which he is so good at. But then he also gets into moral theology, and moral theology has to do with what moral obligations and duties do we have, not just between other people, and not just within ourselves, but between us and God. And that's where he kind of I would say rightfully protests against a sort of radical libertarian morality. Now, remember, I'm somebody who is quite libertarian, so I would say that as I continued to a number of my libertarian beliefs, because when I was in high school, I probably would have been the guy who would have said the thing that C.S. Lewis is complaining about. Oh, so long as I'm not hurting anybody else, what does it matter? But here's the thing: if humans are intrinsically valuable, right, which is kind of the starting point for any moral system. If humans are intrinsically valuable, then that means that if we're going to damage ourselves, we are committing just as much a wrong as if somebody else is damaging us, because we ourselves are damaging something that is very, very valuable. And that value comes from the Christian point of view of being made in the image and likeness of God. So that, I mean, Lewis kind of drives that point towards the end there, and he says, hey, if we only belong to ourselves, sure, we could probably do whatever we want. But if in fact we are created, and if in fact we are created for a purpose, and he hasn't quite yet got to what that purpose is, that's in the upcoming and he hasn't quite yet got to what that purpose is, that's in the upcoming chapters, so I don't want to skip ahead too much, then we have to start thinking about moral relations, not just with other people, but with ourselves and with that which put us here. So he's expanding the moral system, I would say rightfully so, beyond this sort of minimum effective libertarian morality, the so-called non-aggression principle. That's big in libertarian philosophy. You have the non-aggression principle where, a lot of morality just gets reduced down to, so long as you're just not using physical force against somebody, you're more or less good to go. I think Lewis would say, okay, that's a start, but that's not anywhere near enough. And when you start to think about morality, like really think about it, rather than just setting down a set of rules to try and get people to stop killing each other, but more so as a blueprint for human flourishing, which is the first point of this chapter. He's saying when we get the proper conception of morality, it's not God just trying to find I love that first line too. It's not just God up there in the sky trying to ruin everybody's good time. It's a set of operating instructions for how to be most the kinds of things that we are. And when we understand what makes us human, what our human essence is, and this is where he starts to draw out natural law theory, right? We are rational animals, and we're meant to use our rationality to discern what is really good for us. Now, the highest good, the ultimate good, our final cause in Aristotelian terminology or in traditional natural law theory is God. And that's what Aquinas famously argues, that to really understand a thing, I'll just give a brief crash course in natural law theory, is to understand its formal, final, efficient, and material causes, what a thing is made of, what it's made by, what its essence is, and what it's pointed at, what it is aiming towards. So any agent works for an effect, right? An acorn works to turn into an oak tree, so it's good for an acorn to become an oak tree. A triangle, the essence of a triangle, the form of a triangle, we'd say, is a shape with three straight sides that add up to 180 degrees. Well, the essence of a human is a rational animal. And our sort of what Aristotle helped us to, he kind of got the picture, I would say, mostly complete, but Aquinas finished it, is that we're meant to use our rationality to discern what is really good for us, which will fulfill our happiness, right? We're aimed at happiness. And this is absolutely true, because everything we do, when you really think about our lives, is aimed at fulfilling our own happiness. Every decision we make, whether we're correct or not, we make because we think in some way this will contribute to our happiness, either in the short term or the long term. And you really can't think of any exceptions to this. And, you might think you have an exception at first, but when you dive a little bit deeper, you'll realize this morning, yeah, but you did that because you knew if you didn't show up and got fired, you'd be far less happy. So that won't quite do it. And so what Aristotle would say is, okay, our sort of purpose here is to find our perfect and complete happiness, eudaimonia. And the way that classical thinkers thought about happiness isn't exactly the same way that a lot of modern people think about happiness as just a certain brain state. It's really thinking about excellence or human fulfillment. And what Aquinas gave us in light of Christian revelation, but also he would argue that you could deduce apart from revelation, through reason alone, is that our perfect and complete happiness can only be found in the beatific vision, or in eternal friendship with God. That's what we are ultimately aimed at. So what we need to be doing is figuring out how best to dispose ourselves to that, to coming doing, is figuring out how best to dispose ourselves to that, to coming to a knowledge of God and a friendship with God. That's why we are here. That is the only reason we're here, in point of fact. And so in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas kind of famously goes through all the things that people pursue that absolutely won't make you happy: glory, power, wealth, honor, fame, and he shows why none of these things will work. But perfect and complete happiness can only be found in knowledge of God and eternal friendship with God, the beatific vision, heaven, in short. So what morality is then, is it's a set of operating instructions and a blueprint, not just how to get along with other people, but how to tidy ourselves up on the inside, so to speak, to make that eternal friendship possible. At first accessible, and then, and that's what it means, that the idea of freedom, or second chapter. Is it second? Second chapter of my book, How to Be Better at Almost Everything. The idea of freedom for excellence, making what is good for you at first accessible and then effortless. All of that I'm just borrowing from Aquinas and Aristotle and these classical thinkers. That's by no means original to me. And they just develop it even further than I do in my book in a deeply theological sense. So once you understand what it means to be a human and what humans are essentially aimed at, then it makes sense that there's got to be better or worse decisions we can make in life, better or worse actions we can take to either achieve our final cause, to really to really attain perfect and complete happiness. There's going to be better or worse ways that we can go about doing that objectively. So this is a far cry from moral relativism. This is about as objective as it gets. Now, in light of this, Aquinas would also say, and the reason I'm bringing up Aquinas is because he studied a lot of this. He's making it, he's presenting a very popular level treatment of it, and that's what makes Lewis so great, is he can take these ideas that sometimes you only hear about if you're kind of reading philosophy journals, and he brings them down to a level that just makes it so obvious and accessible for pretty much everybody. But he obviously studied this and really knew it very well to be able to present it so simply. So what Aquinas would say is that we can achieve imperfect happiness here on earth, right? But perfect, complete happiness, our true final end, is reserved for the life to come. But what we do in this life absolutely matters. As Lewis was saying, hey, look, my bad temper might not matter that much if I only live for 70 years. But if it's gradually increasing and I am really destined for eternal life, like, this could be a huge problem. This is something that I really need to work on and deal with. So my relationship with myself, my relationship with God, morality encompasses on and deal with. So my relationship with myself, my relationship with God, morality encompasses all of this, right? We don't want to just restrict it to how we interact with other people. We need to think deeply about how we interact with ourselves, our relationship with God, and of course our relationship with other people is in itself, and Lewis points this out as well, a reflection of our relationship with ourselves. If we're not taking good care of ourselves, then we're very likely going to crash into other people. And his analogy of the ships, I think, is really powerful. It's like, okay, yeah, we want the ships to sail in a coordinated fashion so they're not colliding, but if one ship is utterly defective, its steering is broken, or what have you, it's probably going to collide anyways. So you can't even really separate the two. If you want a good society, well, a society starts with, and fundamentally is, a collection of individuals. So we need to pay attention to the individuals and how they care for themselves and how they form their moral conscience and how they treat themselves, because that's what's going to be reflected in the so-called collective or in society. So Lewis is I think absolutely correct, and he's being quite nuanced. So I think we'll probably leave it at that, because to go any further would push us ahead in the book, and I want to make sure that we get Lewis's words first before we get the commentary. But the big takeaway here is that, there's three things I think to get out of this chapter. It's that morality is not just some type of arbitrary set of rules laid down from on high to ruin us from having a good time. Morality, properly conceived, is a blueprint for our own happiness. That's what it is. It's like you want to find your fulfillment. You want to find your perfect and complete happiness. Here's how to live. Here's how to do that. And we might balk at that at first because we might have a disordered will. And this, again, is what Aquinas talks about. And a disordered will means we're pursuing what we think is good because we can't not do that, but we're wrong that just having a certain amount of money is what's going to fulfill our perfect happiness, or living a very promiscuous lifestyle, or what have you. So when we run into these quote-unquote moral rules and they don't match up with the things we're already pursuing, that can be agitating. That can be, honestly, it can be frankly a little bit annoying. And believe me, I've been there. I know what this feels like. But if we have good reasons to believe that God loves us and that God, more than anybody, knows what's best for us, and remember, the whole first chunk of this book was making this sort of ontological moral argument, saying, like, if morality is anything at all, if it actually has positive ontological status, it must be grounded in the divine. You cannot make sense of it in a naturalistic viewpoint. But once we understand that God loves us and wants us to be happy and really knows what is truly good for us, then we can trust his blueprint. We can trust his operating instructions as the person who designed morality is not to ruin a good time. It's a blueprint for our own human flourishing, and it has just as much to do with our relationship with ourselves as it does with our relationship with God, as it does with our relationship with other people. And as we focus on those three areas, they will mutually harmonize and support each other. The more we focus on improving our relationship with God and ourselves, the more our relationship with others will improve as well. And I think those are the big points that Lewis is trying to make. Really, really good chapter. I mean, it's amazing how much he can put in just, what was that? That was like 3.5 pages. Yeah, not even. It's 1, 2, 3, 4.5 pages. I mean, he fit a lot. He must have done some serious editing to make that so concise. But he was a master of his craft. There is no doubt. So, anyway, hope this was enjoyable to you. Remember, if you haven't listened to this, I think we're about probably halfway through the book now. If you haven't been listening to this, I think we're about probably halfway through the book now. If you haven't been listening to the series, the other episodes can be found on my website, chroniclesofstrength.com. Just search, Mere Christianity, and they'll pop up, or on iTunes or where have you. And I'm going to try and continue this again next week. I already have something planned for Sunday school. So yeah, awesome. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this, if you think this is helpful, or want to support the show, please consider leaving a review. Those 5-star reviews help bring new people in. They boost the ratings, all that good stuff. So if you want to help the show, positive reviews and subscribe.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.